Today, we have with us Kevin Dahl, who is the Arizona Senior Program Manager at the National Parks Conservation Association. And we're going to be asking him a couple questions about the history of Earth Day and his participation, along with his perspective on these things. So first of all, we'd like to hear a bit about you. What's your name and your background and your history in the environmental movement?
Thanks, Nicholas. Well, I'm Kevin Dahl, and I've been doing conservation work since 1970, since the first Earth Day. So that makes me an ancient historical dinosaur-like figure, which I completely claim, because I did all that stuff. And thank you for this opportunity to talk about it. Working for the environment has been real important in my life. My current job I've been with for 12 years, but I've worked for other groups that you might know. I was executive director of Tucson Audubon Society for 5 years. I worked for Native Seed Search off and on for 15 years, conserving seeds of crops that were grown by Native Americans. I worked for Friends of the Earth and had a contract once with the Sierra Club, and I guess I've been around.
You were part of the first Earth Day in 1970?
I was in 8th grade. I was 14 years old in Scottsdale, and Scottsdale had elementary schools and high schools. So I was, the last grade before going into high school. And at that point in spring, we're all little snots, full of ourselves. I was in a social studies class. We had a panel discussion on Earth Day topics, air pollution, water pollution, and we had to research some stuff and present some stuff. Then there were questions and answers and discussion. And at one point, I looked at everybody and I said, you guys are just talking about it. You really should be out there doing something about it. And all these hands shot up and said, yeah, Kevin, what are you doing about it? And of course, the rest of my life, I've been answering that question. But immediately I started a campus group. And I'm a little embarrassed by this. Clean up the earth. And the initials are cute. So that's bad on me. And, the environment was a very vital topic back then. To set the stage for you and people of your generation, this was pre-computers. There weren't personal computers. I mean, they would talk about, someday you'll have a calculator that you can fit on your palm and do mathematical calculations. And by the end of high school, we had that, but we didn't have personal computers. All media was television and newspapers. So it was very focused mass media. And the organizers of Earth Day in 1970 did a really good job. And they kind of surfed on this growing concern that we were going to hell in a handbasket. The air in Los Angeles was dangerous to breathe. In Phoenix, in the winter, you couldn't see very far. I was riding my bicycle everywhere, and I wore a gas mask so that I wouldn't be affected by the bad air on the TV would say, okay, tomorrow's going to be a bad air day. People with lung conditions, please stay indoors. There was a river back east that caught on fire, the Cuyahoga River. It had so many industrial pollutants in it that the fire leapt 5 stories high. A river on fire. I mean, this was crazy. And there was, people had been working on conservation for a while. Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, alerted us to how pesticides were killing bald eagles. And so the country was kind of ripe for this idea of a massive, it's basically a teach-in. It was presented as a teach-in and primarily in the universities. It was organized out of Senator Gaylord's office in DC, but it was young interns that got this idea, let's just spread this word through the universities and do teach-ins everywhere. So, they tallied it up. It was 20 million people were involved on Earth Day. To date, that's the largest single day demonstration as a percentage of people living in the United States. So we're all children of Earth Day, I think. Major legislation soon passed. Legislation as a professional conservationist, I use all the time, and now I'm trying to defend against the current president and his administration, who's tearing it down whenever he can. We set up the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, which requires any federal action to do studies to determine whether there's better alternatives, both economically and environmentally. And it was bipartisan. Richard Nixon was president. and he signed all those bills. There were some conservatives that were opposed to this, but there wasn't the huge concentration of pro-business, anti-environment sentiment that exists in this country today. That seems to be a hallmark of the Republican Party.
Yeah. You mentioned that at the time there was greater bipartisan support for the environmental movement, but was there also a certain degree of backlash? There must have been some opposition from some sources.
Yeah, I remember going door to door to raise some money. We were buying some land to add to the Phoenix Mountain Preserve. And I remember, and most people, this teenage kid raising money, he's a good kid, he's not on drugs, he's not in a gang. Yeah, I'll give him a couple bucks. But this one guy just laughed in my face and said, "You're raising money for dirt? There's hungry kids. We got to be working, to feed kids, not buy dirt." And in retrospect, that's a reasonable response that we need to put our charitable dollars and our volunteer time and our lives to support the values that make our lives important. And for him, it was kids. And that's great. I might have been able to get him involved in air pollution issues that were affecting kids' very lives. But he didn't want to buy dirt. There was, the beginnings of this different cultures too. I mean, the environment, especially us long-haired high schoolers, got pigeonholed as part of the hippie new age culture, as opposed to the cowboy or straight-laced business culture. Through the years, I've seen the environment, though, and conservation concerns cut across all cultures. There are ranchers who are the best conservationists in the world. There are people who make their living mining, who love going out and looking at rocks and can share a lot of the values that I share. There was backlash, and the most interesting work is working with people who are naturally anti-environment and seeing what can we do together to improve the environment, and in some cases to help your business or help your children, or because if you're worried about jobs, if the planet's not healthy, jobs aren't going to help us.
In you said that they were teach-ins in the 1970 Earth Day event. Yeah. Which universities were these at? How many people?
I think every university had them. I mean, there was a central organizing group working out of Senator Gaylord's office, producing material that you could copy and use, or you were encouraged to do research on local issues. And a teach-in would be, setting up some lectures, having handouts, having a table at the university mall, getting people to sign petitions. There was intertwining between other movements. We learned from the women's movement, from the peace movement, from civil rights movement, and eventually the gay rights, which became LGBT, and the other letters that I always forget. And there was kind of when I look back in the last 5 decades, there was this progressive thing going on where people would share tactics and support each other. So, it wouldn't be surprising recently at the March for Science, you would see women that would later lead the women's march. This spectrum of tactics include, I think, the most important one, which I learned at an early age, that if you want to do conservation, you can study, wildlife biology or ecology. You can become an environmental lawyer. But it's politics. Politics decides conservation. And we see that to the worst example is the current administration. America made the wrong move, and our environment is suffering incredibly by it. Waiving laws to build the stupid border wall, rolling back funding because you roll back funding for pandemic planning because Obama had success with it. And, you and I know hundreds, if not thousands of people are dying because of his inability to think of science and to take good advice as something that he should be doing as a leader, because he's smarter than everybody and knows everything. So politics is super important.
If you were to point one singular event, sort of in the last 40 years or so, that really changed people's perspective on these environmental issues for the better or for the worse, what do you think it would be?
Any of that landmark legislation in the early 70s, that changed the dynamic completely, because everybody, every business suddenly had to comply with federal law in a reasonable way. If there were ways for you to not pollute that river, then you have to do it. And as one economics teacher I had in high school said, if I know I'm polluting, I'd be glad to clean it up. But if that extra expense means my product or service costs more, if everybody has to do it, great. Then I maintain the same level with my competition as before, and it doesn't really impact me to do that. And that's what's great about these regulations.
How do you feel in regards to the legacy of the first Earth Day? Because you mentioned that there was a lot of environmental change in the 70s with legislation and whatnot. Do you feel that those first Earth Day actions had an effect on that?
Absolutely. Those wouldn't have happened without many people, rising up. And there was a story in every news report for weeks and weeks and weeks about pollution. The legacy of Earth Day goes on. We're celebrating the 50th. I've celebrated every year, some degree or another, and some of them have been more widespread than others. Climate change started becoming a big topic, 20 years ago, and continues to be a topic. I wish we were a lot farther along. I mean, why didn't we do the things we should have done 20, 30 years ago on climate change when we knew? We knew what we were doing, and as a society, but those of us who wanted to change didn't have the political power.
If you were to give any advice to activists right now, people involved in the environmental movement, what would that advice be for achieving this change and progress in the future?
My advice is seek out people who've been doing this for a while. The best things I've ever learned was asking someone, can I be your mentor? Can I figure out how you do how effective you are? And there are people out there doing amazing work, not just in conservation groups, but they're in key places and agencies. They know what the important things that need to happen, and they make that happen. And they've learned a number of lessons. One is all generations have to be involved. It's the stuff about boomers, millennials, Gen X. It's important to recognize those different characteristics. But early on, we're trained not to work with anybody a year or two older or a year or two less, because our education system creates cohorts that are just age, and that's not traditional. And there's a lot of evidence that that's not sustainable, because you've lost the good stories. You've lost the ability to pass on stories to younger people, and we need that so desperately. So seek out people who are doing it and are having fun at it, and see if what they're doing can work for you, and if not, go on to another people. There's a lot of people out there doing this work.
I think on a closing note, if you were to say, what things do you think will make the biggest difference in the future in environmental issues and actions? From your perspective, what would you say these things would be?
Okay, I'm going to go a little new agey here on you, because we have to do this from a place of love. My good friend Richard Elias, county supervisor, died suddenly recently of a heart attack, and he would always end anything he sent out with much love, resist. And that's the best advice. Learn how to do this from a place of love rather than anger, and you will find love in people that, not erotic love, not hitting out on people, but a place of, I appreciate you as a representation of the universe that we're trying to save, this sacred planet. How can we work together to stop this horrible thing that's happening? So resist, much love.
Much love. All right, well, thank you very much for talking with me and for answering our questions. I think there's so much to learn from each other's perspective, and we're really grateful, all of us here at Arizona Youth Climate Coalition, for all the work that you've done. We hope to speak to you soon.
Thanks, Nicholas. Anytime.